back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we discuss issues of importance to our Black and Brown communities. My name is Michelle Jacobs, and I'm here with my co-host, Ray Smalls. Ray, we just scraped by and survived the 2022 midterm elections.
I don't know about everybody else, but I was gripping. Although, Michelle, I think I took your advice and I did not watch any coverage until very, very late in the evening.
Good.
And it was at that point that I finally realized that we might come out of this thing okay. Because it was supposed to be a landslide, a red tsunami, red wave. Any term with red was, GOP guys were using that. But it ended up turning into a red blip.
Yeah, which was good. I mean, we'll have another 2 years of an inactive Congress because of the split. But
unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, but at least no further damage will be done by legislation. So that's the best we can hope for. That's the best we can hope for.
And what about the issues? Anything on the issues that comes to mind for you or stands out for you?
Well, in terms of the failure of the red wave to materialize?
Yes.
Well, I'm hoping that now we can push through the rest of the judicial nominations that are still open, because that's the job of the Senate. And perhaps we can re-examine this issue of the filibuster.
Yes.
Other than that, I would just say, don't get any more fires started. Just not have any more fires. That would be great. Yeah. But speaking of issues, during our last episode on the challenges of the midterm elections, we talked a little bit about the abortion issue. As we listen to these anti-abortion advocates now and the legislators, it becomes clear that the legislators don't know much about the reproductive cycle or about women's bodies. They just don't know. They just seem to care about contraception.
Right,
so today we wanted to focus on the health aspects related to abortion, and we've brought back a previous guest, Dr. Alicia Christie, who is the Deputy Director of Reproductive Health and Women's Health Services for the Veterans Administration and a member of the class of 1977. And she's going to help us work through some of these issues. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Christie, and let's jump right into the issues at hand. By now, most people know that in June of this year, the Supreme Court upended nearly 50 years of protection for a woman's right to obtain an abortion that was established in Roe versus Wade. From your perspective as a physician who specializes in women's health care, how significant is this Dobbs decision?
So before I answer that question, I want to spend just a few moments talking about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, because I feel very strongly that the Dobbs decisions was reproductive injustice. So with reproductive rights, you're talking about a legal approach, and it's usually individualistic. Whereas with reproductive justice, it's more expansive and holistic. And so an example is you might have the legal right to have access to IUDs. But if you're not able to access them and you're not able to find a provider that can provide that care for you, then that's not reproductive justice. So you have a right, but that certainly is not justice. And so the Dobbs decision is reproductive injustice because it takes away abortion care for a number of women. And as a result, it poses a threat to the lives of our patients. And as a physician who specializes in women's health care, that's the issue that angers me the most. Women will die as a result of the Dobbs decision.
Okay, before we go to our next question, I just want to back you up a little bit and tell the audience what an IUD is, because we might have some men in the audience.
Okay. It's an intrauterine device. It's a contraceptive device. And it's what's considered highly effective contraception. And so is more expensive and requires somebody like a gynecologist or a GYN nurse practitioner to provide that care, because it's a contraceptive device that's actually inserted in the uterus. And so that's why somebody might have a right to that care, but are unable to access it.
So as we understand, as we've seen in the public debate, many male legislators in particular don't seem to understand how a woman's body works. We've seen comments, for example, that women don't need to have a rape exception in the abortion laws because women who get raped are not capable of getting pregnant. So how do these myths about a woman's body arise, and how can the medical profession help us combat them?
Well, I think there's two things that are important. The first is the best way to combat misinformation is with truth. And along with that, it's important to identify what is the most effective way to disseminate that truth. And so is that through medical organizations like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists? Is it through community outreach? Or is it through your own individual medical practice, or a combination of those? The second thing is we also need to hold individuals accountable who spread that misinformation. And in the case of politicians, that price can be paid at the ballot box, as we saw in the midterm elections.
This is sort of, I'm injecting this, but in Virginia, a couple of years ago, they were trying to pass a bill where if a woman wanted to have an abortion, she first had to have a pelvic ultrasound. And the legislators were thinking that was, they kept calling it jelly on the belly, right? And they wanted to have the obstetrician, OBGYNs come in and testify that that's not what that was. But they had this weird rule in the Virginia chambers that you couldn't say vagina in debate. So in order for the doctor to testify, he would have had to say vagina, and then so they wouldn't have allowed him to say it. So they continued to go on thinking this was jelly on the belly.
Did they allow colloquialisms at all?
You know, it was so weird, but finally an OBGYN got on the news and explained what it was. And they became so embarrassed that they didn't even understand what they were legislating, that they backed up a little bit off the bill. But it's things like that that women are confronting.
And that's one of the additional injustices. I have a number of colleagues who work in the area of abortion care, and that's medically unnecessary. To have that ultrasound in many cases is medically unnecessary. So you are subjecting women to medically unnecessary procedures that don't have scientific evidence to support it. And that's not only an injustice, it's potentially dangerous. And so another example of this, and I don't recall which politician it was, but clearly with zero medical background and probably zero science background, was making the claim that you could take an ectopic pregnancy, a tubal pregnancy, move it from the tube into the uterus and it would be viable, which is absolutely medically not the case. But if as a legislator, he was able to pass legislation to make that happen, think of how many women's lives would be put into danger by somebody who has no medical knowledge, who's trying to dictate medical care.
Again, and explain to us what an ectopic pregnancy is.
An ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy that's outside the uterus. So the most common place is a tube. And so because the tube is much smaller, eventually what happens is the pregnancy grows and eventually the tube bursts, ruptures, and that can cause life-threatening hemorrhage. And so the treatment for that is either medication to cause the pregnancy to stop growing and therefore, the tube not rupture, or surgery to remove the pregnancy in the tube. And he was claiming that you could go in, do surgery, take the pregnancy out of the tube, put it in the uterus, and that it would grow normally, which is absolutely never happened, no evidence for it. But you can imagine the health risks associated with attempting to do something like that.
Yeah.
Michelle and Alicia, there was in Missouri a politician that was running against former Senator Claire McCaskill, Todd Aiken, who made the incredible statement that women have an ability to, have an abortion themselves, right? They can stop.
Yeah, a legitimate rape. Wasn't he the
Rape.
legitimate rape?
Yes,
The
yes,
legitimate
yes,
rape
yes.
guy.
The
So,
contradictions there are just too many.
well, ignorance is bliss, I guess, in that part of the country. But I just want to go back and ask the question about education. And, that happened 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and we're still facing the complete ignorance in our society of how a woman's body actually works.
Yeah.
Alicia, in your time as a physician, what have you been, maybe I should just ask, what types of education about that for our communities have you been able to inject as part of the discussion? And did you have any success with it?
Well, I serve on the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Healthcare for Underserved Women. And a lot of what we do is education of providers and patients. And the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has a really wonderful site for patients. It's patient education about every aspect of reproductive health care you can imagine throughout the lifespan. And so I use a lot of those materials with my patients, and I also refer them to those sites. And I tell patients the best thing you can be is an effective advocate for yourself. And the best way to be an effective advocate is to be informed. That's
great for everybody. I mean, should take that under advisement, just because the type of things that have come out of our politicians today are just frightening. But so our next question is about anti-abortion activists. And, Alicia, they state that their goal is about saving the life of the fetus, but their work doesn't actually stop there. They're targeting both birth control medications as well as in vitro fertilization. Isn't that approach contradictory?
It absolutely is contradictory to oppose both abortion and contraception, but it's not surprising. And so I often relay a story about a science reporter was interviewing a former Supreme Court justice. And they were talking about, again, the intrauterine device, the contraceptive that's in the uterus, and the fact that there's no scientific evidence that it causes abortion. So the science does not support that. And what the justice responded was, the science doesn't matter. And this was in regards to the Hobby Lobby case. If the employer believes, with no scientific evidence, that intrauterine devices, IUDs, cause abortion, they can deny their employees access. So if your employer was, say, a Jehovah's Witness, could they deny you a blood transfusion? If for some reason your employer was an anti-vaxxer, could they keep you from immunizing your children? So it's only when it comes to reproductive health care, people's prejudices and unfounded beliefs can keep people from receiving the medical care that they need. So my position is, any statement that starts with the science doesn't matter should be considered unacceptable. The other thing that doesn't make sense to me is to restrict abortion access and not expand maternal and infant care and resources. So for instance, Mississippi, which has some of the most restrictive abortion laws, they already have the highest maternal and infant death rates, and that's just going to increase. And they have no plans to expand those services. So these people are pro-birth, they're not pro-life. IVF is a complicated, a little more nuanced issue. And so, for instance, the Attorney General in Tennessee recently determined that if you discard embryos from IVF, that's not subject to an abortion ban. That's not abortion. And in Arkansas, Alabama, and Oklahoma, those attorney generals have all indicated the abortion restrictions have no implications for IVF. And this is my personal belief, but I think it has some evidence to back it up. Because IVF is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and because any IVF restrictions are going to disproportionately affect affluent women, primarily affluent white women, I think they're going to treat IVF differently. And the Attorney General's responses so far, even in some of the most conservative states, support that. And so they make a differentiation between an embryo in the lab and an embryo in the uterus.
Which is discriminatory because poor women, especially poor women of color, they would not even be able to think about in vitro fertilization anyway.
Exactly.
Right. So it's interesting because just last week, I think ProPublica was looking at this group called the Susan B. Anthony for Life group in Tennessee specifically. And one of the things that's happening with that advocacy group is they're trying to go to the lawmakers and say, look, abortion is a hot issue right now. So let's wait for a minute until it cools down, and then you can go after IVF and birth control. And you know, the story in ProPublica has the tapes of this group discussing that and what their strategy is going to be to get rid of IVF, which I thought was just insane. If you're concerned about women having children, why wouldn't you want women to who want children to have children, right? And that's the purpose of IVF.
Well, you know, there are members of the Catholic Church that are opposed to IVF because it's creating life outside the body. So there are some people that object to that on a religious basis. But I really think that because there is so much money involved in the industry, and because the people in positions of power have often needed those services themselves, or they have friends or family members who've needed those services, I think they're less likely to restrict them. That's not to say that they won't, but I think they're less likely to restrict them. I think they're less likely to restrict contraception just because of the blowback that they think that they'll get. And so, for instance, with the issue of, for instance, gay marriage, there are a lot of people who oppose gay marriage, but I think at this point, if they tried to make interracial marriage illegal, there would be so much blowback to that, even if that's something they truly desired, that they don't consider it feasible. Not that they don't want to do it and not that they wouldn't do it, but they don't consider it as feasible. They think that there would be a price to pay.
Supreme Court
so
Justice,
that's why.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but Supreme Court Justice Thomas has already told us where they want to go.
Right.
He's already said that.
Right. And it's not the will of the people. And I think these last midterms showed politicians that if they do that, there's a price to pay. And so I think that there are probably millions of people who would love to do it, but they're not willing to pay the price that they would have to pay if they did do it. So I think they'll chip away at the edges. And so I think, you know, I don't think that they'll get rid of contraception access, but I think they'll make it harder for poor Black and brown women to get it. But I don't think that they'll eliminate it.
And even making it harder is problematic, right? Because it's already extremely hard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do want to say on a positive note that I am encouraged by the numbers of young people and women that came out in response to the attacks on reproductive rights. And on election day, I volunteered as a poll watcher, and I was so happy to see young women. Some of them were wearing t-shirts. One of them had "Girls Just Want to Have Fundamental Rights." You know.
Nice.
Sweet. That's sweet.
Yeah.
I can't repeat what was on one of the other t-shirts.
Right. No. Okay. Yes. It's a clean show now.
Right.
Well, it's clean within limits.
No, but I really do. I've been reading a lot of stuff about how the youth vote was the organizations that targeted the youth and went out and understand that the future is theirs. And if they want to have a future with rights, they've got to start now protecting them. So I was very happy to see the youth vote come out. So, so Alicia, you've touched on how dangerous the Dobbs decision is for women and the connection with death. There was just recently a woman from DC who was pregnant, went to one of these states, I think it was Ohio, and she had some kind of medical emergency with the pregnancy, and they wouldn't treat her in Ohio because according to their law, that violated the anti-abortion stuff. So she was left like bleeding. Are we seeing these types of stories occurring more frequently? And how are doctors? It's a compound question, but also in the Tennessee statute, they're trying to shift the burden of proof onto doctors to make them responsible for proving that the surgeries that they went through, say if it was an ectopic pregnancy, was actually necessary in order for them to avoid criminal charges. So speak to those two issues, the frequency in which we're seeing women being left in terrible condition and the burden that's being placed on doctors.
Well, I think the most critical point to understand is that women will die as a result of the Dobbs decision. As you both know, I paint and I did some artwork, and it was two healthcare providers consoling each other with the text, "Women will die as a result of the Dobbs decision." The American Society of Reproductive Medicine put that on their social media. And I think that is the major message that we need to send. Women will die. Women are dying. And in fact, there was an article where they did mathematical calculations about the percentage increase of maternal deaths in states that have restrictive laws. And so, for instance, in Florida, maternal deaths are estimated to increase by 29% as a result of the restrictive abortion laws. And what sometimes people aren't aware of is that when they say women will die, it's not just women that die of complications of self-managed abortion because they can't get a legal abortion. It's also women that have pre-existing conditions like hypertension or heart disease or diabetes, and they're forced to carry pregnancies to term that they would have terminated, and they die as a result of those pregnancies. The other thing that happens, and you alluded to this, is because of these restrictive laws and the concerns about criminalization and loss of licensure, physicians may hesitate in providing emergent abortion services that are needed. So if somebody is miscarrying, the procedure that you do to complete the miscarriage, you use the same equipment and the same methods as you do in a pregnancy termination. And so if a physician is concerned about having adequate documentation and they delay, that woman can bleed to death. The same thing with an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy that's outside of the uterus. And also there are situations, for instance, if someone has a new diagnosis of cancer and they're pregnant and the chemotherapy that they need will end the pregnancy and they're restricted from receiving it, and they're at greater risk of dying of their cancer. So there are all sorts of situations where women's lives are put in danger because of these restrictive, unjust laws. And in terms of the impact on physicians, many of them may hesitate in an emergency situation. And one of the reasons for the EMTALA legislation, where you're required as a physician to provide the emergency abortion care in life-saving situations, but it's not an entirely straightforward situation, because if the lawmakers in that state decide to go after you anyway and decide that the documentation isn't sufficient, you may still pay the ultimate price for having provided that care. And that's actually one of the major reasons why the law changed in Ireland, which is a very Catholic country, because there was a woman who was having a miscarriage and she was hemorrhaging, and they were trying to get an exemption so they could provide the abortion care to her to complete the miscarriage, and she died.
Ugh, crazy.
Right. So those sorts of things will kill women. And what you are also seeing is that physicians who do provide abortion care, some of them are no longer providing it, or they're moving away from states where they can't provide it.
It's a terrible situation, and I don't think people really appreciate or understand how difficult it is. So one of our Nubian tigers is Dr. Yvette Bridges, and she's an OBGYN, and she worries about the far-reaching impact on the abortion restrictions on the profession itself. And the reason she worried about that is she said if abortions are banned in states that have medical schools, where the medical school is situated in a state that has an abortion ban, they won't teach the procedure. And so when these new doctors are out in practice and they experience someone who needs an emergency abortion, they won't know how to do that. So is that something that we should be concerned about?
Dr. Bridges is absolutely right to be worried. It will impact training. And we're already seeing that students are choosing not to train in restrictive states. And in fact, I mentor some students and I tell them, you know, if you're interested in obstetrics and gynecology, do not go to a state with these restrictive laws. Do not train there. And I've even told some of them that are interested in other specialties, I said, if they have those kinds of restrictions about abortion care, there's going to be other restrictions for healthcare that are going to limit your practice. And is that really someplace you want to train? So OBGYNs are leaving these states. Students are choosing not to train in these states. And as a result, I want to read something from the American College of Graduate Medical Education. And they proposed revising the requirements, clarifying that access to abortion education and clinical training is essential for physicians specializing in obstetrics and gynecology, and simulation exercises are not a substitute for hands-on experience with patients. And so the ACGME and those organizations accredit medical schools. So if medical schools in these states are at risk of losing their accreditation, then I think that will get their attention.
Okay, yeah, hit them in the pocket.
Yeah, that's where it hurts the most.
Yes.
Yeah, I prefer kick them in the nuts, but
okay, we can go with that too.
See, I told you this. I told you, Michelle, we weren't that family oriented.
Yeah, well, there's no bad words there. Those are all words.
Okay, all right. So, Alicia, I'd like to go back to Dobbs for a second and ask you, since you are in the military and you've been in the military for decades now, and also a doctor within the military, you must have come across some of your patients who were active duty or whatever, who had unwanted pregnancies and might have needed an abortion. How will Dobbs affect those people that are in the military versus any average citizen out not serving?
well, you know, I have to say I'm no longer in the military. I'm a VA physician now, but I have to say, as a veteran and a former Army doc, I am really happy to report that both the Department of Defense and the VA have policies in place to protect abortion access for active duty service women and veterans in cases where the life of the mother in the DoD is threatened, and in cases of rape and incest. In VA, it's life or health of the mother. And we have been told, as I mentioned earlier, that we are not detectives when these women tell us that these pregnancies are a result of sexual assault. We are to believe them. And both DoD and VA have published policies, and the secretaries of both of the Army, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of the VA secretary, have published statements announcing their commitment to provide these services to active duty service women and women veterans. And it's important to point out the reason why they have that commitment is because it's an issue of patient safety. And so in cases where the pregnancy is a threat to the woman's life or health, it is an injustice to require that woman to put her life in jeopardy because of an unjust law. An unjust law that, by the way, is not the will of the people, because 2/3 of Americans think abortion should be legal.
So now my next question or follow-up question would be, so what happens if you are active duty and you're raped? Okay, we know that the different branches of service have had a hard time prosecuting these kinds of cases. Okay, and not all the time are we worried about the woman's health at that point. But what about those rapes that are
Right.
that happen within the service?
Right. So if the pregnancy is a result of sexual assault or incest, they can receive abortion care through DOD, or if they're a veteran, through VA. It's a separate issue in terms of holding the perpetrators
Responsible,
accountable. And that's an area that needs work. That's an area that the Secretary of Defense has said that he's committed to addressing. Within VA, if somebody has a history of military sexual trauma, and that includes sexual harassment, not just sexual assault, they can get care related to the military sexual trauma in the VA. Even if they're not eligible to get all of their health care. So for instance, they can get counseling, or if, say, they sustained a physical injury as a result of the assault, they could get care for that physical injury.
Okay. So and that would be true even for military facilities that are in a state that has an abortion ban.
Yes, because we are under federal law.
Right.
We are not under state law.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. So it's really.
So we have supremacy.
Okay. That's good, because we wouldn't want to see a tiered process of healthcare within the military itself, because of some.
Which is why they came out with that policy, and which is why the legislative offices of both DOD and VA have said that you cannot lodge criminal charges against VA and DOD healthcare providers who are providing care that's consistent with their duties in VA and DOD policy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't keep some zealot AG from going after somebody, and that is definitely a concern. But the legal offices have stated we have supremacy, and you cannot go after our employees.
That's good to hear that, because somebody's going to try.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me try to bring this discussion back around to you and the medical profession. I know it may sound like I'm picking on Tennessee right now, but that ProPublica article just disturbed me so bad.
That's okay, we don't mind.
One of the things I said in the article was that the Tennessee bill was a trigger bill, right? They passed it before Dobbs was decided, in the anticipation that if Roe was ever overturned, then the trigger bill would take effect. And the doctors that they talked to said at the time, they didn't say anything about the bill as it was being debated, because they never thought Roe would be overturned. So they hadn't actually participated as medical persons in the debate as to whether or not Tennessee should have this really restrictive abortion law. So now here we are post-Dobbs. Everybody knows it did happen. And we start to see some OBGYN doctors groups organizing and engaging in advocacy. What would you like to see your profession, your branch of the medical profession, engage in now on this issue? And what's ahead for you in terms of how you're going to keep your your finger on the pulse?
So I'm very encouraged by some things that I'm seeing by medical societies. So for instance, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, ASRM, in the midterms, there were reproductive rights proposals on the ballot. And ASRM went into all 6 of those states, and they were successful in all 6. And they went in with ads, they went in with advocacy, and they actually created a new reproductive care protection fund. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they are providing practice guidelines for abortion care, as well as provider training at no cost, as well as legislative advocacy. Major medical journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association and Lancet, they're publishing editorials supporting legislative change and medical training. The National Medical Association, which is the major medical association for African-American physicians, and a little bit of history here. Prior to integration, African-Americans were not allowed to join the American Medical Association, the American Dental Association, the American Bar Association. So they created their own, and they were all called national. So the National Medical Association, the National Bar Association, National Dental Association, are all the Black providers in those fields. And so the National Medical Association had a big get out the vote initiative. And I was really delighted that they used some of my artwork in that. And they also now that the midterms are over, they are still doing get out the vote initiative among the Georgia chapter of the National Medical Association. So I think legislative change will be key. And there's also an organization called Vote ER, which is a group of ER physicians. And they actually have developed toolkits for voting. And so I don't think I have one of the badges here, but anyway, they give you badges for free that have a QR code. And if you scan the QR code, it will take you to a site where you can verify that you're registered. You can register to vote. It will tell you where your polling place is.
Excellent, excellent.
Yes, so the week before the midterms, I wore it to clinic and, asked all my patients, are you registered? Because oftentimes for physicians, particularly if they're in university practices or government practices, you have to be nonpartisan. So registering and voting are nonpartisan. But when you educate patients about voting for your health, there's usually specific parties and candidates that are supporting that. So even though it's nonpartisan, I see nothing wrong with directing patients to places where they can get more information about what a particular candidate will mean for their access to healthcare.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And it's really everyone now, all hands on board, right? There's no one can just sit back and say, well, I'm just an observer in this battle, because we're way beyond that point, and everybody's got to do what they can.
And Michelle, I'm encouraged by what Alicia mentioned with the states that struck down all of the anti-abortion legislation that they were, or referendums that they were trying to put forth. And I thought Kansas came out of nowhere for a lot of people with their striking of that same sort of legislation. And I don't know, Alicia, if you thought that Kansas was a harbinger of positive things within the nation regarding abortion legislation.
I do. And in fact, I was at the National Medical Association meeting in Atlanta when that came out. And I was very, very encouraged by that. But, it to some degree is human nature. People are very reticent to give up rights that they have. So if you look at the Affordable Care Act, how many times have they attempted to repeal that?
Exactly.
And good luck with trying to get rid of Social Security and Medicare.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
so I think, you know, they have awakened a sleeping giant by trying to take away these rights.
Yeah. Well, we could sit here and talk to you for all night, but we're gonna wrap it up by asking you, as we do all of our guests, what's the one takeaway you want, if our listeners can't absorb anything else you said tonight, what's the one thing they've got to leave?
Your vote is your voice. And so be an educated voter, know who's going to support your health care, and vote accordingly.
That's a great message.
Thank you
so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much. Well, that was an information-packed discussion, wasn't it? Dr. Christie never fails to deliver on the issues. And as I mentioned, I wanted to focus this show on the health aspects of the abortion issue, as opposed to the politics or the legal aspects of it.
Right. And of course, I mean, being the legal scholar that you are, Professor Jacobs, you know, that would be a whole nother episode. But I mean, to make a long story short, I think that this is just one of those issues that separates different sectors of especially our community, because folks in the Black community, abortion and LGBTQ issues really do separate us in a lot of ways with our votes, and unfortunately we haven't overcome those issues yet.
No, we haven't, and hopefully next year we can start to do a more in-depth look at the issues within our community that we're afraid or hesitant to talk about.
Yes.
And crack that door open a little bit, so maybe we can jumpstart some discussions in the community about those very sensitive issues. If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, nubiantigerspodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.